Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we do thank you for allowing us into your presence, and to know that you allow us to have such a sweet and personal, intimate relationship with you that we get to drink in your presence and your peace and your strength. And so as we dig into your word now, we ask that you help us to examine our own lives, and that you help us to see ourselves through your eyes, through your word. And that before we leave here tonight, we would know what it is that we need to surrender to you, and how you are challenging us to be changed into your likeness. And so please, God, be glorified through the teaching of your word. And it's in your name, Jesus. Amen. Joseph is the man we're going to talk about tonight. And I know that it's a little bit different. Kind of the setting is a little fitting. Did y'all know we have this room in the church? I had no clue. Okay, I mean, some of y'all probably did. If you grew up at First Baptist, you probably know about the boiler room and all those kind of spaces. But anyway, we were looking for a pit. And frankly, we don't have any pits in First Baptist. But we thought this would be the perfect setting to talk about our next ordinary person who did extraordinary things for God. And that's Joseph. And Joseph's story is one that is pretty familiar. But I don't know about you, but as I grow older, Joseph's story means something totally different than what it did years ago when I first heard it. When I was in college, I went through the Experiencing God Bible study for college students called God's Invitation. And at that time, I was really wrestling with, okay, well, what is God's call? Is it missions? Is it ministry? What form of ministry? What's the big calling? 30 years down the road, what should I be shooting for? And Henry Blackaby used Joseph's story because it's a beautiful example of how God took someone who was very average and he used him in different situations. He was basically sold into slavery. He was used in Potiphar's house. He was framed and then placed in jail. He was in prison. He became the leader of the prison, the head of the prison, and then he was placed second in command in Egypt. Well, Blackaby asked the question, which of those jobs was Joseph called to? Which one of those had God prepared Joseph for? I thought that's the perfect question. For me, where I was in college, I was really trying to find what is God calling me to? What is a big job? And Blackaby made a great point. He said God had called him to each one of those jobs. Because in Genesis, starting in chapter 37, you'll see that Joseph's story, it's just littered with God's hand of favor is on Joseph. Because Joseph glorified God no matter what the situation was. When Joseph was sold into slavery, it was because his brothers were very jealous. Joseph really didn't help himself out very much because his dad favored him. He made the coat of many colors. We thought about maybe shooting this in front of Burlington Coat Factory, but it had been too noisy. But he didn't help himself because he told his brothers about this dream that he had that basically, to paraphrase the whole thing, they would end up bowing down to him. Okay, if you're already one of the younger ones in the family, help yourself out and keep your mouth shut a little more often. You know what I'm saying? I'm child number 5. I learned very quickly to keep my mouth shut because I got beat up a lot. The other day, we just had a family get-together at the house. And my next older brother actually admitted for the first time in my life, he tortured me. Thank you very much. And I didn't even have a coat of many colors. I just had the nickname Perfect Son. I'm fine with that. That's great. Anyway, the brothers were very jealous. So they tried to get rid of him. They did. They got rid of him. So when he was sold into slavery, he goes to Potiphar's house. Potiphar buys him. Potiphar is in service to Pharaoh. And so there's something about Joseph that is just very different. And chapter 39 of Genesis says this. Starting in verse 2, it says this. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. And Potiphar put him in charge of his entire household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. And it's simply someone who was in a terrible circumstance, being sold into slavery. It doesn't get much lower than that, but he still continued to live out his faith, and he glorified God even in that circumstance. So you fast forward, he ends up being framed by Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown into jail. He's put in prison. But his character never changed. Joseph continued to live a life that was glorifying to God. And so what happens there? Well, you see that Joseph was still seen as being favored by God. You also have the story of the cupbearer, the king of the Pharaoh's cupbearer and the chef. They come into prison also. They're being punished and they're thrown into prison. They have dreams. Well, Joseph is there and he gets to hear their dreams and he interprets the dreams for them and it actually comes to pass. Well, the cupbearer was restored to Pharaoh. And Joseph asked him, would you please remember me? When you go back to Pharaoh, please remember me. Well, he said he would, but he didn't. 2 full years later, he is still in prison. Joseph is still in prison. The cupbearer is back with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has a dream then. And that's when finally the cupbearer remembered, oh, there was this guy in prison. And he was able to tell me my dream. What was his name? Joseph. He could probably tell you what your dream means. So Pharaoh calls for this guy to come out of prison to interpret the dream. So he did. And it's really cool that in chapter 41, when Pharaoh asked Joseph about the dream, Joseph simply says, now this is after years, 2 years in prison, after having been a slave, after having been basically killed for all practical purposes by his own family. Joseph could have been very bitter towards God, but he wasn't. And listen to what he says. When Pharaoh said to Joseph, will you interpret my dream? Joseph said, I can't, but God can. That shows what kind of character Joseph had. No matter how bad the circumstances was, no matter how bad the pit, no matter how dark the dungeon was, Joseph continued to glorify God. So, Pharaoh's dream was pretty much just a foretelling of a famine that was to come. And it was going to take over the land. And it was a warning that they needed to store food for this famine. So once Pharaoh hears all this, he recognizes just how blessed Joseph is. So here's what Pharaoh says in chapter 41, verse 39. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. This was an inmate. This was a former dungeon dweller that Pharaoh looks at him and says, you are going to be mine, and I will be the only person that is in charge of you. That's crazy. But that's God. And that's how an ordinary person submitting daily to the Lord's leadership can become elevated. And it wasn't for Joseph's glory, it was for God's glory. And so Joseph continued to serve God, and he was elevated just because of that. So the rest of the story is the famine actually hit. And when the famine hit, Joseph's family back home, they're experiencing like everybody else. They're experiencing very, very tough times, and they're starving, and they need help. So they come to Egypt for assistance. And when some of the brothers come to Egypt, well, they encounter Joseph. And Joseph, he kind of plays around with them because they don't recognize him. It's been years since they've seen him, but he recognizes them. Well, he doesn't just run up and embrace them. he kind of plays with their emotions a little bit. We don't have time to go into every little detail of their story of going back and forth and playing and sending this one back home and this one coming back and, oh, you took my cup. And, well, we don't have time for all that. But here's the moral of the story. When it came time to reveal himself, the family came, they received the assistance that they needed, and Joseph helped them out. And Joseph told them who he was, and they were afraid. They were extremely afraid. I mean, could you imagine? Now, if this was happening in the South, oh, there would have been retribution. You know what I'm saying? I mean, Bubba would have been given a 6-pack of something and $50 in a tree stump somewhere, and somebody would have been taken out of here. But this is Joseph. And Joseph told him, look, after their dad, after Jacob died, after all this time, Joseph had been helping them along, been feeding them, they were taken in, and they were well cared for. But then Jacob, the dad, when he passed away, the brothers were even more afraid because they thought, Dad's gone. Joseph could have us killed, and he could get rid of us. But Joseph told them, guys, what you meant for evil and what you meant for harm, God has used for good. And he says this in Genesis chapter 50. In verse 20, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. This is one of my favorite stories because it gives me extreme comfort. Because here's the circumstance. It seemed like a dead end. It seemed like a pointless, hopeless situation that was full of evil, that was full of harm towards Joseph. But God was in control, and God knew. God saw the big picture, kind of like the helicopter looking at a crime scene. The guy from above can call orders and tell the cops where to go, where to turn, where to twist and go. And God had all this master plan laid out years, even before Joseph was born. But when he was in that pit, when he was in that dungeon, when he was in the jail, when he was in second in command, God saw exactly what he was going to do. Because the nation of Israel was blessed because of what happened to Joseph. And as a result, we have all been blessed because of what happened to Joseph. So, what are some takeaways? Look, with a story like this, you can take away so many different things. It depends on where you are right now in your walk with the Lord. Lots of takeaways here. You could say that what seemed like a dead end was God's purpose and plan. God had a lot to accomplish through this seeming dead end. You could also focus on Joseph's forgiveness. You know, if you look back at your past, you could probably find someone somewhere that you are holding on to some kind of grudge. Maybe they wronged you. Maybe they did something just despicable to put you away, to put you down, to get you out of the way so they could elevate themselves. I mean, I could hold it against my brother because he finally admitted he used to torture me. You know what I'm saying. There's probably somebody in your past that needs to be forgiven. And also another takeaway would be that in each of these situations, Joseph still glorified God, no matter what the circumstance looked like, no matter who was around him. Just because he was in the dungeon by himself, or he was around inmates in the prison, or he was being given this power at Potiphar's house or in the Pharaoh's kingdom, it didn't matter. He stayed steady and he glorified God. And one of the things I respect the most about Joseph is that his perspective was one that he kept God at the center of his perspective. He focused everything on God, not on his own personal agenda. He wasn't trying to promote Joseph. He wasn't trying to promote the family name. He was simply living out his faith, and he kept God at the center of all that he did. And he also realized that there was a purpose in everything. And that to me shows extreme wisdom. At the very end of everything, Joseph kept his perspective. And he said that what you guys meant to be evil against me was just simply God's plan. and God using all of us because God has saved so many lives through the pain that he had to experience. That reminds us all that there's always purpose in the pain. That no matter what your circumstance is, you may not understand it today. You may not understand it in 2 years. It may be a generation. But there will come a time as you continually submit your life to God, you'll hopefully see one day the purpose that God used for this pain. And then finally, what seems like a dead end, no hope, pointless situation. Remember this, that God is in control and that we need to simply trust him. Just like Joseph did, we all need to do that too. So, to finish out this time, what we're going to do is we're going to ask that you all get in groups of 3 or more, and we're going to give you 2 discussion questions, and they'll be here on the screen. And we're going to ask that y'all go ahead at this time and get into your groups. It could be a family group, it could be just 3 individuals or more. It doesn't matter. But if y'all will quickly and quietly go ahead and get into your small groups, and then watch the screen for the 2 discussion questions.